Hi everybody. The spinal cord is an elongated cylindrical structure. It measures about 45 centimeter. It is located within the vertebral canal. During head and neck dissection, we actually break open the vault of the skull, enter the cranial cavity and remove the brain. For spinal cord dissection, we have to break open the spinous process, the lamina of the vertebra, and then enter the vertebral canal. And this has to be done all the way from cervical segment up to the sacral segment. It's quite a tedious process which takes a lot of hours and a lot of hard work. It's not routinely done, but it's not done by the UG students, but the postgraduate students dissect it. So definitely you'll get to see specimens of spinal cord in dissection hall. One thing that I want to highlight is, since you enter the vertebral canal, the first thing that you'll get to see of the spinal cord is its posterior surface. Okay, remember that. So once you get the spinal cord specimen in your hand, you can turn it front and back, but you'll be a bit confused to identify which one is the anterior surface, which one is posterior. Of the two images given here, can you try to identify which one could be anterior, which one could be the posterior view of the spinal cord? This is the anterior view. In the anterior view, you can make out the anteromedian fissure. The anteromedian fissure is in the midline. In the anterior aspect, it's quite deep. Okay. Whereas on the posterior aspect, you can see the posteromedian sulcus. Another very important clue is you can see the dorsal root ganglia in the dorsal root, which attaches to the posterior aspect of the cord. This is how you get to identify the anterior and the posterior view of the spinal cord. Cross section of the spinal cord, you can easily identify the central canal, the gray matter surrounding it, and the outer white matter. But the dimension, the breadth of the spinal cord is very less than 1 centimeter. So the internal features of the spinal cord cannot be identified in dissection hall. You have to stain it and view it under the microscope. And special stains are used to stain the nervous tissue. And this is how you'll get to see it in the microscope. This one is the cervical segment of the spinal cord. This is thoracic segment of the spinal cord. This is lumbar segment of the spinal cord. This is sacral segment of the spinal cord. So you can appreciate that when you take a section of the spinal cord, what you're going to see inside is going to differ. Okay, what you see depends upon where the section is taken. So the external features you can appreciate: the anteromedian fissure, posteromedian sulcus, the ventral root, the dorsal root ganglia. The internal features of the spinal cord can be appreciated only under histology. Okay. Now, the spinal cord ends at the level of L1, lower border of first lumbar vertebra. Below that, it continues as bunch of nerves. This bunch of nerves that you see here is called chorda equina. Organization of gray matter and white matter in brain and spinal cord. So gray matter, it's made up of cell body of the neurons, and the white matter is made up of myelinated axons. So in the brain, in the cerebrum and cerebellum, the gray matter is situated on the periphery and the white matter inside. They have an outer gray matter and inner white matter. This outer gray matter, we are going to call it as cerebral cortex, and in cerebellum, cerebellar cortex. And inside the white matter, in cerebrum as well as in cerebellum, you can see collections of cell bodies, and these are termed as nuclei. In cerebrum, we call it as basal nuclei. In cerebellum, they are called deep cerebellar nuclei. Coming to the spinal cord, So you know this is the central canal. It's surrounded by the gray matter. And outer to this gray matter, we have the peripheral white matter. The gray matter is further divided into anterior gray horn, posterior gray horn. The anterior gray horn lodges the motor neurons. To be more specific, it has the lower motor neurons. And the axons of these lower motor neurons will contribute to the descending tract. Okay, remember? Whereas the posterior gray horn will have the sensory neurons. These are called the second order neurons. And the axons of this will contribute to the ascending tracts, your sensory tracts. Whereas the white matter that you see here, which is made up of the myelinated axons, the white matter is further divided into anterior funiculus, posterior funiculus, and lateral funiculus. The white matter lodges the tracts. So as told earlier, the internal features of the brain and the spinal cord can be well appreciated only when you stain it and put it under the microscope and see it by means of these histological sections. So a special staining has to be done to identify the cell body of the neurons as well as the axons of the neurons. What you see here, that's the sections of medulla, the lower medulla. So here, that's the central canal. The central canal is actually surrounded by the gray matter, which appears pale in this stain. This is the white matter, which appears more darker. Our normal eosin hematoxylin can't be used to stain the nervous tissue. Here again, the spinal cord. You can see the gray matter. It's sort of pale, whereas the outer white matter is darkly stained. From these sections, you can appreciate that, as I told you, this is cervical segment, this is thoracic segment, this is lumbar segment, and this is sacral segment of the spinal cord. From these segments, you can appreciate that the amount of white matter decreases as we go down, and the amount of gray matter increases as we go down. And in certain regions, you can see that the anterior gray horns, they are more bulkier to accommodate the motor neurons, which are going to form the plexus. Okay, so this is the cervical segment. You can see the anterior gray horn here is much larger. Okay, because it has to accommodate more number of motor neurons that are going to contribute to the cervical plexus. And if you remember from your general anatomy that all the plexus are formed by ventral rami. Okay, so here this is for the contribution of lumbar plexus, and this one for the contribution of sacral plexus. And something special here in the thoracic segment. So you see an anterior gray horn, you see a posterior gray horn, and here there's a small lateral horn in the thoracic segment of the spinal cord. This lateral horn lodges the cell bodies that will give rise to the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Okay. Coming to the coverings of brain and spinal cord, you know that the brain and the spinal cord are covered by the meninges. And these meninges include from outer to inner, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Okay. So the dura mater is the outer tough layer. And the dura mater that covers the brain is further divided into two layers, the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. The endosteal layer, it lines the inner surface of the cranium. It is also called endocranium. Whereas the meningeal layer of the dura mater is actually adherent to the endosteal layer except at certain places. What happens? The endosteal layer and the meningeal layer are separated to enclose the dural venous sinuses. Okay? And at those places, the inner meningeal layer will form folds that will extend between the parts of the brain. These are called dural folds. The arachnoid matter that you see here is a thin, transparent membrane. It is avascular. It loosely surrounds the brain. The pia matter is also thin, transparent, but vascular. Okay, and it closely covers the brain surface. So this is just a comparison between the three layers. I've told you about the dura mater, the two layers, the dural folds and the dural venous sinuses. The arachnoid matter I told you it is thin, transparent, avascular. It loosely covers the brain. It's going to bridge over the sulcus. Okay. Arachnoid villi, I'll show you a picture. The pia mater, meanwhile, that is also a thin, transparent layer, but it is vascular. Okay. Vascular. It closely invests the brain surface. It dips into the sulcus. And these are modifications of the pia mater. I'll explain it to you soon. So this is a picture to show you. That's the endosteal layer. This is the meningeal layer. Between the endosteal and the meningeal layer, can you see the dural venous sinus here? This is the superior sagittal sinus. The cerebral veins, you can see them entering the superior sagittal sinus. Inner to the meningeal layer is the arachnoid matter, the thin, transparent, avascular layer that's going to loosely cover the brain. The pia mater is thin, transparent, vascular, that closely covers the brain. Actually, you can't strip off the pia mater from the brain tissue. If you try to do that, you actually damage or tear the brain tissue. Yeah, this is another diagram to explain the three layers. You see the outer dura mater, then you see the arachnoid mater. This is the pia mater. Okay. You can see the arachnoid matter, this thing. It sort of bridges over the sulcus, that you can appreciate here. Whereas the pia mater, this yellow one that you see here, it dips into the sulcus. Okay. Now, there is no space between the endosteal layer and the skull. But there's a space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. This space is called subdural space. The subdural space is traversed by the cerebral veins, which are going to open into the dural venous sinuses. Okay. This is the arachnoid mater, this entire thing. It's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. The space between the arachnoid and the pia is called the subarachnoid space. It's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Another important thing, the larger blood vessels that are going to supply the brain, they lodge in the subarachnoid space. Yeah, there is no extradural space in the cranial cavity. Remember that. A word about the arachnoid granulations. So this is the arachnoid membrane. Okay. What happens? This arachnoid membrane will project into the interior of the dural venous sinus. This is called arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulations. Why is it important? Because these arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulations are the site of absorption of CSF. Okay. So at this area, the CSF from the subarachnoid space is absorbed into the dural venous sinus. I want to explain to you these three terms. Please follow me. Okay. So I told you the subarachnoid space contains the larger blood vessels. Now branches from these larger blood vessels will enter the brain substance. As it enters the brain substance, it carries a sheath of pia mater with it. This is called perivascular sheath. Okay. And at place where there is ventricle, the blood vessel, the pia mater will project into the ventricle, and you know that the ventricle is going to be lined by ependymal cells. Okay. So all these together, the ependymal cells, the pia mater, the blood vessel, all together it's called the choroid plexus. Okay. And of the three components of the choroid plexus, the pia mater component of it is called tela choroidea. I hope you have understood all the three terms. So we have seen that the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this is our arachnoid matter, what is shown here. And we have seen that the arachnoid matter loosely covers the brain. At certain areas, what happens? These subarachnoid spaces are dilated. They are filled with large amount of cerebrospinal fluid. These dilated subarachnoid spaces are called subarachnoid cisterns. Okay. Why it happens? Because in these areas, the parts of the brain, the adjacent parts of the brain, they are bit separated. Okay. And the arachnoid is going to bridge the gap between these two. And when the gap is more, this space gets dilated. These areas are called subarachnoid cisterns. Subarachnoid cistern is an important 5-mark question for you. You can see here the cisterna pontis, interpeduncular cistern, cisterna ambiens, cerebellomedullary cistern. Okay, and each of these cistern has some important content in it. We'll be learning it later. The cerebellomedullary cistern that you see between the cerebellum and the medulla is the largest of all these cisterns. It is also called cisterna magna. We can introduce a needle into this space to withdraw the CSF for diagnosis. Okay. This procedure is called cisternal puncture. Coming to the coverings of spinal cord. So the spinal cord is also going to receive all the three meninges. From outer to inner, that will be the dura mater. The dura mater is the outer layer, the thick and tough protective layer. The arachnoid membrane, I told you, it is thin, transparent, avascular, loosely covers the spinal cord. The pia mater is again thin, transparent, vascular. It closely invests the spinal cord. Okay. The main difference is that the spinal dura mater is a single layer. It has only the meningeal layer. Okay, that's the main difference between the cranial dura mater and the spinal dura mater. Now we know that the spinal cord ends at the level of lower border of first lumbar vertebra. Okay, and I told you below that it's going to continue as cauda equina. Now what's happening to these coverings after the termination of spinal cord? So the dura mater, the spinal dura mater will extend below the termination of the spinal cord and gets attached to the second sacral vertebra. The arachnoid mater also follows the dura mater. Beyond the termination of the spinal cord, it continues down and attaches at the second sacral vertebra. The pia mater, what happens, I told you, it intimately covers the spinal cord. So after the termination of the spinal cord, the pia mater that covers the spinal cord continues below as filum terminale. Okay, so this is the filum terminale. This filum terminale attaches to the dorsal surface of first coccygeal vertebra. This is a nice picture. So you see the vertebral canal. This is our outer dura mater. It's quite thick, tough layer. This thin, transparent web-like structure, that's the arachnoid mater. The pia mater can't be separated from the spinal cord itself. Now, the space between the vertebral canal, the bones forming the vertebral canal and the dura mater, that's called the epidural space. This epidural space contains the internal vertebral venous plexus. The space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater contains a very thin film of capillary fluid. It's called the subdural space. The space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is called the subarachnoid space, and that contains the cerebrospinal fluid. The main difference between the cranial dura mater and the spinal dura mater I told you. The spinal dura mater is single layer. It has only the meningeal layer. Okay. And there are no dural folds in the spinal cord. And we have an epidural space present within the vertebral canal. The blood supply to the central nervous system is by means of two sets of arteries, the vertebral artery and the internal carotid artery. The vertebral artery arises from the first part of the subclavian artery. The course of the vertebral artery is quite long and it is divided into four parts. The first part of the vertebral artery is its origin in the neck in the region of scaleniovertebral triangle. The second part of the vertebral artery extends from foramen transversarium of the sixth cervical vertebra to the foramen transversarium of the first cervical vertebra. The third part of the vertebral artery is the one that we see in the region of suboccipital triangle, after which the vertebral artery passes through the foramen magnum to enter the posterior cranial fossa as the fourth part. The internal carotid artery, it arises from the bifurcation of the common carotid artery opposite the upper lamina of the thyroid cartilage, which corresponds to the disc between C3 and C4. The internal carotid artery is called so because it's going to supply the structures within the cranial cavity. After its origin in the neck, it ascends up posterior part of the neck. It enters the carotid canal, which is seen in the inferior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. It passes through the carotid canal. The upper opening of the carotid canal is in relation to the posterior margin of foramen lacerum of the middle cranial fossa. So the structures within the cranial cavity is supplied mainly by the fourth part of the vertebral artery and the internal carotid artery. Also remember that the fourth part of the vertebral artery lies in the posterior cranial fossa and the internal carotid artery enters the middle cranial fossa. The picture that you see here is the inferior surface of the brain, the base of the brain. What you see here is the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. This is the temporal lobe and behind is the occipital lobe. Here you can see the olfactory bulb, the olfactory tract, the optic nerve, optic chiasma, the optic tracts. This is the inferior surface of the hypothalamus where you see the stalk of the pituitary, the tuber cinereum. I've told you this is the region of interpeduncular fossa. Here will be the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain, the crus cerebri region, the pons, the medulla oblongata. The midbrain, the pons and the medulla, they are called as the brainstem. So this is the vertebral artery, the fourth part. On entering the posterior cranial fossa, you can see that the vertebral artery of both the sides, they unite to form the basilar artery. This basilar artery lodges over the basilar sulcus seen on the ventral surface of the pons. And at the upper border of the pons, this basilar artery will terminate into posterior cerebral arteries. The branches from the vertebral artery, basilar artery, they'll supply the pons, the medulla and the cerebellum. The internal carotid artery that you see here will give rise to branches that will anastomose with the posterior cerebral artery and they together form a circular anastomosis. This arterial circle in the region of interpeduncular fossa is called circle of Willis. The branches that arise from the circle of Willis will supply the brain, the different surface of the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral arteries, they supply the cerebrum. The choroid arteries are the name given to those arteries which are going to supply the choroidal plexus, the ventricles. The cerebellar arteries, I told you, they are going to arise from the vertebral artery and the basilar artery. The anastomosis between the two vertebral artery to form the basilar artery is a very unique feature happening in the cranial cavity. It doesn't occur elsewhere in the body. The venous drainage of the brain. So these veins of the brain are thin-walled. Normally, we know that any blood vessel has 3 layers: the tunica intima, the tunica media, and tunica adventitia. The veins of the brain, they are devoid of tunica media and tunica adventitia. They have just the tunica intima, which is made up of endothelial cells. That's why they are called thin-walled, and they are not provided with valves. These veins, the cerebral veins, they drain into the nearby dural venous sinus. Coming to the blood supply of the spinal cord. So in this diagram, you can see that this is the anteromedian fissure. This is posteromedian sulcus. This is the anterior gray horn, posterior gray horn, that's the central canal. So the blood supply to the spinal cord comes from the anterior and posterior spinal arteries, which are branches of the vertebral artery. But you know that the spinal cord is an elongated cylindrical structure which measures about 45 centimeter in length. So the blood supply that's coming from the anterior and posterior spinal arteries is not sufficient for its entire length. Hence, it gets the segmental arteries. For example, the cervical segment of the spinal cord will receive its blood supply from branches that come from the ascending cervical, deep cervical arteries. The thoracic segment from branches of posterior intercostal arteries. The lumbar segment of the spinal cord gets its blood supply from branches of lumbar arteries. The sacral segment of the spinal cord from the lateral sacral arteries. And these are all called segmental arteries. These segmental arteries will anastomose with one another and also with the anterior and posterior spinal arteries to form longitudinal trunks. There are 3 longitudinal trunks, one running in the anteromedian fissure and 2 on the posterior aspect behind the dorsal roots. Now, these 3 longitudinal trunks will anastomose with one another, forming the vasa corona. And the branches that arise from the vasa corona will enter the substance of the spinal cord to supply it. The veins that drain the spinal cord, they are again arranged as longitudinal trunks along the length of the spinal cord. There are 6 longitudinal venous channels, 2 in the median aspect, 1 in the anteromedian fissure, 1 in the posteromedian sulcus. This is the anteromedian fissure, that's the posteromedian sulcus. And 2 anterolateral, which you see behind the ventral root. 2 posterolateral, which you see behind the dorsal root. These 6 longitudinal venous channels, they finally drain into the internal vertebral venous plexus. This internal vertebral venous plexus, remember where is it present? In the epidural space of the vertebral canal. There will be a separate class about the development of central nervous system. I just want to give you one word here. So the trilaminar germ disc, you know, consists of 3 layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, of which the ectoderm is further going to differentiate into surface ectoderm and the neuroectoderm. So the neuroectoderm is the one which is going to give rise to the different parts of the central nervous system. So neuroanatomy, in the gross anatomy part, you'll be learning all this either from an order above to below or from below to above. And each topic you'll be learning it under 2 headings, the external features and the internal features. External features are the one that you can appreciate in the dissection hall using the specimen with your own eye. Whereas the internal features, you have to look into the specimens that are stained using special stains. And the internal feature, you should be able to appreciate the location of the nuclei and the location of the tracts. Embryology, as I told you, there will be a separate class talking about the development of the different parts of the central nervous system from the neuroectoderm. Textbooks for neuroanatomy that I would suggest that I've listed here, all of them are equally good. I have heard opinions that the recent edition of BD Chaurasia. It's good. It contains a lot of clinical features. But what I actually got to read was Vishram Singh, and that elicited the basic concepts of neuroanatomy very well. Inderbir Singh is at a higher level than the Vishram Singh. Things that are not mentioned in Vishram Singh, you can see it in Inderbir Singh. Okay, it's at next level. Snell, there are two books, Snell Clinical Anatomy, Snell Neuroanatomy. Snell Neuroanatomy is very good when you want to read it in depth, especially the spinal cord tracts, all that is all well listed. Certain tables in Snell are really very, very, very useful. Gray's Anatomy, of course, is the referral book for anything. Whenever you have doubt in any of these books, you have to at once take Gray's Anatomy and refer for concluding your doubts. Cunningham, the previous edition of Cunningham, is really very, very, very special. The things that are mentioned in Cunningham, certain things, you cannot find it in any other textbooks. Okay, so it's up to you to decide what book, but definitely start reading. It's high time you start reading your neuroanatomy now. When I decided to take an introduction about the neuroanatomy, I asked one of my students from the 2K19 batch of Madurai Medical College, Monish, to help me with the diagrams. He has given me wonderful diagrams as you see here. Hope I'll be using it in the upcoming lectures. Thank you.